Since Obamacare passed, there has been 80,000 more deaths. Since Obamacare passed, there is not a study out there that shows that anyone had any positive effect from expanded Medicare except for women and children. And women and children, that coverage was not expanded.
And you know why? It's bizarre, but you know why they think those numbers are like that? It's not because you go to the doctors, like healthcare improves.
Yeah.
It's because, are you going into this? I don't want to.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Because they believe what is happening is people who did not have insurance before, who are healthy, okay, and don't really need insurance, or would not have needed it. They would got through the year, they would have been healthy. But they were previously uninsured. Now they are, a good portion of these people have been able to get access to things like opioids, which are starting addictions, and they are overdosing. The overdose rate is actually explaining much of the difference in the death rate. It's showing up in places where Medicaid was expanded at a higher rate than in places where it wasn't. So we know the opioid thing's really bad for everybody. However, it's worse in places where you've increased and given away free insurance, where these people are going to get the free drugs and they can start addictions or worsen them, or free up money to buy worse things like heroin.
Isn't that fun? That's so fun.
I mean, again, you can never predict these things. There's always unintended consequences. Certainly, Obamacare was not passed with the idea to kill people.
No.
But it's still...
And again, it's not Obamacare that has killed people. It is people choosing now what to do with their money or their doctor that's killing 80,000 more people.
Although,
and that was 1 year, and I'm not going to do what the left does. I just want to point out that when it comes to Medicaid, there is, with the expansion, grandma's not going to lose her Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to lose and have to go on to the government dole in another way are the only ones that were expanded, and those were for adults that aren't in a special, need. They're not the elderly, and they're not the women and children. That's who is supposed to be covered by all of this. They're the groups that grew. There was no impact. The only impact in positive health was for women and children, and that part was not expanded.
It's really beautiful of you to put it that way, but I am going to do what the left does. And I'm going to say Obamacare is single-handedly killing 80,000 Americans a year.
Oh, my God.
80,000 Americans a year with its bare hands.
I would just like to look at the president's record. Now, every president will say to you when he's running, I'm gonna make Jerusalem the home. Huh? Really? The home of the embassy? Really, are you? Because everybody says that and nobody does it. He did it. And I think that's going to go down as the biggest game changer possibly in my lifetime. It already is. It is changing the game in Iran. And there are riots in the streets now in Iran. Streets in Iran, in some towns, it looks like a war zone because the people have risen up. And that's going to continue to build. And when it does, this president is going to come out and say something directly to those people, that we support them. And that's going to add fuel to the fire. And you might see a regime change and a collapse of the Islamic regime in Iran. And it will be 100% Donald Trump that made that responsible. 100%. You're going to see changes because of this. He kept that promise. A promise I said, he's not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that. He did. How about the president's coming up and saying, well, I know I can defeat ISIS. I know I can do it. I'll defeat ISIS. He did. And did you notice no one in the press even talked about it? All of a sudden, we're not talking about ISIS anymore. How come? Oh, I know. President Trump. That's why. How many people? Well, we're not going to be involved in these global agreements for global warming. Right, sure. I'm on record saying he will never do that because his daughter is a huge global warming person and he only listens to the family. Wrong, Glenn. Who else is doing that? Just that is enormous. Going to stop the TPP. Right, sure you are. Yes, he did. I'm going to bring North Korea to the table. Gee, looks like that's happening. Give everybody a tax cut. I don't like the tax cut. I think he could have gone a lot further, but that's not even his job. His job is to sign things that Congress puts in front of him, not to design it. How many times did he ask? And you know what? You Republicans in Congress disgust me. You disgust me. Imagine what we could do if we had the House and the Senate and the White House. Yeah, I can imagine what you'll do. Nothing. You'll do nothing. When was it? Was it 1948, that it was a do-nothing Congress? No, I think we've got one now. Can anybody name one thing that they've done? Tax cuts. Oh, whoa, well, don't put yourself out. The repeal of Obamacare. Yep, didn't get that one done. Is that really his fault? Well, you could say, he didn't use the bully pulpit. No. Again, Congress. He would have signed anything. As long as it fulfilled that promise, he didn't care what it looked like. He would have signed anything, and you got nothing done. His campaign promise, I'm going to have a 10% repatriation tax. Now, I think this one is dangerous. He did it. 10%. Bring all of your money back into the United States. It will create jobs. Yes, it will also create inflation, but it's creating jobs. Does anybody feel like America is beginning to get on track somewhat economically? You know why? Because he fulfilled another promise. Stop over-regulating the American people. Give them their money. Give the companies the opportunity to expand and bring their money back into the country. And maybe they'll build buildings. Maybe they'll build offices. Maybe they'll build new products. Maybe they'll build new factories. Maybe they'll hire a bunch of people. Now, I know Seattle is trying to do everything they can to make sure that everybody in their city is homeless and unemployed. But the rest of the country is enjoying the feeling of, wow, maybe things are going to be okay. The executive orders? Yeah, he's reversed a lot of Obama's executive orders. I don't know of a president that is, because I'm really used to read my lips, no new. These are outrageous promises. These are outrageous promises. This isn't, I'm just going to stand up against the Democrats and not raise taxes. These things are, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm going to kill and dismantle the enemy that the president before me arguably created and couldn't defeat. I'm going to defeat them. I've got maybe 10 minutes. I think we can get that done in the first term. And they did. Not a small feat. I'm going to cancel the Iran deal. Yep. None of these are small. I'm going to bring North Korea to the table. Oh, yeah. Everybody's tried to do that. Now they're at the table. We don't know what's going to happen. So the result of that is unknown. But has anybody else done that?
Mark Morano, author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. Mark, how you doing, buddy?
Very good, Doc. Thanks for having me on today.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, there's some good stuff in here. In fact, Chris and I saw a headline this morning that says Antarctica is melting 3 times as fast as a decade ago.
Yeah, that's one of the climate scams that they do. First of all, you notice they say decade. Antarctica has been going through all sorts of cycles. However, this study used climate models to estimate how much ice there is. And the United Nations even admits models don't even account for half the variability in nature. So they have a huge fudge factor. But more importantly, in the book, I go back to 1901, 1922, in the 1970s and then forward. They've had the same exact scares about Antarctica recycled over and over about how it's going to flood Europe, flood the United States, and they just keep recycling them about what may happen in the future. The reality is a NASA study showed 2 years ago and a new NASA study coming out to reaffirm that as a whole, Antarctica is actually gaining ice. And the irony is they originally said Antarctica was going to lose ice due to global warming. And then when they came out and saw it gaining ice, they said, oh, well, that's actually what's going to happen. Global warming will make Antarctica at least gain the sea ice portion, not the land ice. And now they're saying, well, it's losing ice. But they can't keep their story straight, and it's literally a recycled scare over and over. Bottom line is Antarctica as a whole actually gaining ice, according to NASA, and contributing to a sea level lowering. Sea level has been lowering due to Antarctica's gaining of overall ice.
You hear what's going on here? Do you hear?
Yeah.
Couple of things. We're going to be overrun by ice.
Yep.
Right? We're a second ice age. Is that what you're saying, Mark?
Well, actually, that's a separate story. There's actually solar scientists, and particularly the Russian National Academy of Sciences, yes, Russian collusion, who claim that sunspot activity is now at centuries low, and there's a worry that we are facing at least decades of a cooling due to low sunspot activity. Depends on how long it lasts. But carbon dioxide, by the way, is not the control knob of the climate. That's the message I scream from the book with Nobel Prize-winning scientists, former UN scientists. There are hundreds of factors that influence our climate. We do not control the climate with our SUVs or our coal plants. That is, and believing that the EPA or UN can control the climate or storms is believing in medieval witchcraft. They used to blame witches for bad weather and for crop failure. Now they blame our cars. That's how insane this has become.
Do you notice how many times he is referenced, like back 100 years ago? He's stuck in the past. He denies modern science.
He doesn't know about the Jews
going on.
having that weather machine.
That's right, all of that. Yeah. That's what we're hearing, Mark.
Well, here's the thing. When you open up the show by saying that decade, what they do, and this is their insidious tactic, they'll say it's worse than we thought, global warming. It's like, how could it be worse? Sea level's not accelerating according to tide gauges. Polar bears are at or near record numbers. Global temperature, the hottest year scam is that the temperature is in a pause or a hiatus. What they'll say is, oh, it's the hottest year on record. Yeah, it's within hundredths of a degree of the last time you declared a hottest year 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And you realize these are well within the margin of error, these claims. And then you go through all the other data, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, droughts, either on no trend or declining trend. But they say it's worse than we thought. How do they make that claim? Simply because they make predictions of the future much worse than they were 2 or 5 years ago. And they get short time scales. Well, the last 3 years, this has increased X amount. Therefore, in 100 years, we expect X, Y, Z. When current reality fails to alarm, make scarier and scarier predictions of the future.
Everything we're seeing today can be found within the pages of these 2 books. I will add a third book to this, but not tonight. It's almost as if the radicals of today are using them both as an unabridged playbook to kickstart their own modern-day revolution. When I was at Fox, we talked about this extensively. This is the copy that I first made my notes in to share with you, and it's terrifying. It might be one of the scariest books you'll read. until I assign you the third book to read. It's a call to arms to radicals. It's an attempt to awaken the leftist sleeper cells to bring forth a violent revolution. It was written by communists masquerading as democratic socialists, and it talks about the imminent collapse of the capitalist culture. This book is trying to collapse the West. Now, it was first published in France in 2007 when I found it, and it was split up into two parts. The first part is a bunch of, Marxist crap, basically complaining why they believe capitalism is the root of all that is evil in the world. But the second part is more disturbing. Beginning under the section called Get Going, the authors lay out a pathway to revolution. The main strategy is to wait for a crisis, economic, environmental, or political, then begin attacking government institutions, corporations, and police. Now think about that. Think about that for a second. And then listen to what is happening to the Department of Homeland Security just over the last few days. The acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Claire Grady, sent a department-wide memo on Saturday warning people of recent developments. She said, quote, "This assessment is based on specific and credible threats that have been levied against certain DHS employees and a sharp increase in the overall number of the general threats against the DHS employees." Grady goes on to instruct the DHS employees not to wear any identifying markings outside of official buildings, not to talk about where they work or in public or in social media, and to keep their windows and doors locked in their homes. She warned them to be alert and aware of any unexpected changes in their neighborhoods. Does that sound healthy? Last week, WikiLeaks went and did it again. They leaked more information, over 9,000 current and former ICE employees and all of their information. They did this, quote, to increase accountability. Or did they? What kind of accountability are you looking for by pointing radicals to people's homes? It's not an oversight that they're looking for. It's insurrection. Ever since that leak, DHS has received over 20 credible threats. In one instant, a burnt and decapitated animal corpse was left on a DHS employee's porch. I don't know. Sound good? This recent assault on DHS is almost taken directly out of the insurrection. In fact, let me quote, "We live under an occupation, under police occupation. Undocumented immigrants are rounded up in the middle of the street." And they go on to talk about how they're going to act. Let's see here. Therefore, weapons certainly don't have a hope of rivaling theirs, the police, in firepower, but it can be used to hold them at a direct distance, redirect attention, exercise psychological pressure or force passage, and gain ground by surprise. Now, would this include a decapitated and burnt animal corpse on the front porch? Would that qualify as psychological pressure? What about just making physical threats? Stalking DHS employees at their homes, swarming them at restaurants? Where does it go from here? Even the LA Times is pumping the brakes a little bit and asking whether all of this has gone too far. I think yes is the answer to that. But don't get me wrong, that's good. If we don't get more people to stop and take a breath here, we're going to get dangerously close to the final section in the book. This section says things like, take up arms. Take up arms, do everything possible to make their use unnecessary. Against the army, the only victory is political. There is no such thing as a peaceful insurrection. Weapons are necessary. It's a question of doing everything possible to make using them again unnecessary. Well, you can't have a revolution without first a controlling of the narrative. You've got to own the culture, or your movement is dead on arrival. Democratic Socialists will not be covered as the radicals that they are. They'll be covered as innovative, millennial-friendly upstarts, fresh ideas on how to rescue and save the country from the tyranny of white patriarchy and capitalism. It'll be covered as a people's movement. See, this is what people have been clamoring for under the tyranny of President Trump. So, who are the Democratic Socialists of America? Well, we've gone over this before, but we really need to start learning about them and sharing with friends. You're going to be hearing a lot more about the DSA. It's not a third party. It's been around since 1982 as an activist organization with chapters around the country that host meetings, like the one in California that actually hosts, readings from Karl Marx. Sounds so fun. The DSA, quoting their own website, believes that both the economy and society should be run democratically to meet human needs, not make profits for a few. So in other words, we're all going to vote on what we take from people. Two groups that have been around since the early 1970s merged to form the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. One of these groups was called the New American Movement. It was founded by the people who splintered off from the Students for a Democratic Society. If the SDS sounds familiar, then you either lived through the 60s or you've watched some of my programs and remember them as the group that produced Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, and the Weather Underground terrorist group that was responsible for 25 bombings in the early 1970s. Now, to be fair, it was a benevolent terrorist group. They always called ahead and said, hey, we're about to blow up the police station. In 2011, the DSA joined Antifa groups in the Occupy Wall Street movement from day one. Now, at that time, the DSA only had 6,500 members. But since then, the group has mounted a national student debt campaign. Here, I got a lot of debt. We're here to help. That's worked wonders in roping younger recruits in who like the sound of government giving them a free ride. The DSA has also thrown its support behind the Black Lives Matter movement and has helped raise money for the National Network of Abortion Funds. Although, for a group dedicated to free universal health care and a guarantee of basic income, they'll still remove some of the major rationales of women choosing abortion. The DSA's crowning achievement, I would say, would have to be their push to make Bernie Sanders president in 2016. Part of that effort included their People's Revolution 101 program, which the Democratic Socialists of America sponsored seminars teaching people basic democratic socialist principles. By election day, the DSA membership was up to 8,500. But since Trump's inauguration, the DSA membership has exploded to over 24,000 members, with 100 new local chapters started just this last year. Most are new members, and they're between the ages of 18 and 35. So, what are the basic democratic socialist principles? Well, according to their website, it's working to legitimize socialism as a mainstream part of U.S. politics. Quote, we are socialists because we share a vision of humane social order, based on popular control of resources and production. Popular control. Economic planning, equitable distribution, feminism, racial equality, and non-oppressive relationships. We are socialists because we are developing a concrete strategy for achieving that vision, for building a majority movement that will make democratic socialism a reality in America. Any keywords stick out there? Popular control of resources and production, economic planning, and equitable distribution. There's no way around it. Socialism and communism are kissing cousins. The only difference is when this concrete solution begins to fail, that's when somebody grabs a gun and socialism goes to communism. Socialism really is just diet communism. Putting democratic before socialist is the diet part. It makes it seem, a little less Stalin and more Bernie Sanders. But where did the term come from? Lenin used to refer to himself as a democratic socialist. He wrote, we social democrats always stand for democracy, but not in the name of capitalism, but in the name of clearing the path for our movement. That pretty much describes the strategy of the Democratic Socialists of America. In America, socialism has always been fused with progressivism. Now this is progressivism on steroids.
Every president is tested, whether it's media backlash, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, even war. But no president, other than Abraham Lincoln, has had to go to war against his own people for the sake of saving the nation. This is the front door key to the home owned by that special president nearly 200 years ago. And this is the Gettysburg Address. Yeah, the real one, written in his own hand. So let's tag in somebody who's allowed to even touch this. Lincoln handed this handwritten copy to Edward Everett on November 19th, 1863, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lincoln used this address to remind Americans of those core principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence 77 years ago. He urged Americans to come together so that, quote, "These dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." But to Lincoln, it wasn't just about saving the Union. It was about saving a group of Americans, too. This is a letter Lincoln wrote to abolitionist Joshua Reed Giddings in 1860. Lincoln wrote, quote, "If I fail, it will be for lack of ability and not of purpose." Lincoln's years in office had a huge purpose, and he gave his life for it. This is a bloody piece of Lincoln's collar from the jacket he was wearing the day he was assassinated. But as tragic as his death is, we should be thankful that it didn't happen 2 years earlier. Because without this speech and the leadership of this man through America's most divided time, the Civil War could have ended very differently. Whatever you are, be a good one. Abraham Lincoln was this nation's 16th president, and a good one.
Mark Morano, author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. Mark, how you doing, buddy?
Very good, Doc. Thanks for having me on today.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, there's some good stuff in here. In fact, Chris and I saw a headline this morning that says Antarctica is melting 3 times as fast as a decade ago.
Yeah, that's one of the climate scams that they do. First of all, you notice they say decade. Antarctica has been going through all sorts of cycles. However, this study used climate models to estimate how much ice there is. And the United Nations even admits models don't even account for half the variability in nature. So they have a huge fudge factor. But more importantly, in the book, I go back to 1901, 1922, in the 1970s and then forward. They've had the same exact scares about Antarctica recycled over and over about how it's going to flood Europe, flood the United States, and they just keep recycling them about what may happen in the future. The reality is a NASA study showed 2 years ago and a new NASA study coming out to reaffirm that as a whole, Antarctica is actually gaining ice. And the irony is they originally said Antarctica was going to lose ice due to global warming. And then when they came out and saw it gaining ice, they said, oh, well, that's actually what's going to happen. Global warming will make Antarctica at least gain the sea ice portion, not the land ice. And now they're saying, well, it's losing ice. But they can't keep their story straight, and it's literally a recycled scare over and over. Bottom line is Antarctica as a whole actually gaining ice, according to NASA, and contributing to a sea level lowering. Sea level has been lowering due to Antarctica's gaining of overall ice.
You hear what's going on here? Do you hear?
Yeah.
Couple of things. We're going to be overrun by ice.
Yep.
Right? A second ice age. Is that what you're saying, Mark?
Well, actually, that's a separate story. There's actually solar scientists, and particularly the Russian National Academy of Sciences, yes, Russian collusion, who claim that who claim that sunspot activity is now at centuries low, and there's a worry that we are facing at least decades of a cooling due to low sunspot activity. Depends on how long it lasts. But carbon dioxide, by the way, is not the control knob of the climate. That's the message I scream from the book with Nobel Prize-winning scientists, former UN scientists. There are hundreds of factors that influence our climate. We do not control the climate with our SUVs or our coal plants. That is. And believing that the EPA or UN can control the climate or storms is believing in medieval witchcraft. They used to blame witches for bad weather and for crop failure. Now they blame our cars. That's how insane this has become.
Do you notice how many times he is referenced, like back 100 years ago? He's stuck in the past. He denies modern science.
He doesn't know about the
what's going
Jews
on.
having that weather machine.
That's right, all of that. That's what we're hearing, Mark.
Well, here's the thing. When you open up the show by saying that decade, what they do, and this is their insidious tactic, they'll say it's worse than we thought, global warming. It's like, how could it be worse? Sea level's not accelerating according to tide gauges. Polar bears are at or near record numbers. Global temperature, the hottest year scam is that the temperature is in a pause or a hiatus. What they'll say is, it's the hottest year on record. Yeah, it's within hundredths of a degree of the last time you declared a hottest year 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And you realize these are well within the margin of error, these claims. And then you go through all the other data, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, droughts, either on no trend or declining trend. But they say it's worse than we thought. How do they make that claim? Simply because they make predictions of the future much worse than they were 2 or 5 years ago, and they get short time scales. Well, the last 3 years, this has increased X amount. Therefore, in 100 years, we expect X, Y, Z. When current reality fails to alarm, make scarier and scarier predictions of the future.
There's some interesting spending habits of Gen Z. Gen Z is the generation after the millennials. Tell me about their spending habits.
Well, one of the interesting things there's a little crossover between Gen Y and Gen Z, the millennials, or Gen Z and the millennials. One is that
millennials were also called Gen Y.
Yeah.
Because it was X,
exactly.
then Y, then Z, right?
And so, the Gen Zers, they're between 7 and 21 years of age right now, right? They're not really in the workforce yet, but one of the most interesting things that they prefer to own instead of rent.
Right.
If you ask them what's most important, owning a home, renting a home, definitely renting a home. If it's owning or renting or owning a home, if it's renting or owning a car or taking public transportation or Uber, they want to own a car. 33% would give up their cell phone to own a car. 33% of Gen Zers stated that they would give up their cell phone. That's huge.
Now the home thing.
The millennials don't want to own. They would much rather rent and not have to maintain.
So the Gen Zers are kind of with them on the home thing, and that might be they're a little young too, but not buying as many homes, which affects everything. But they're back to wanting to own cars.
Yes.
Which millennials were out. They didn't want to own if they had viable public transportation. Now, some of this was they didn't want the responsibility because they wanted to spend that time doing other things. I get that. And they didn't have the money, so they prioritized. This is one of the things I always praise the millennials for. They actually prioritize, saying we have less money as a generation than the previous generations, and we would rather have the phone, so I won't get a car.
Yep, and we would rather spend our money on the experience than the item, right?
Okay.
So one of the big crossovers where they are very similar is that they spend their number one consumable or non-essential product that they spend money on is food.
Oh, Gen Z?
Gen Z as well as the
millennials were kind of like that, right?
They're pretty much even. As a matter of fact, several of the Gen Zers interviewed had a budget of $100 to $125 a week for food, for dining out.
Dining out?
And they would actually occasionally bump that to $125 to $150 to accommodate what they wanted to do that week.
That's a lot of money for eating out.
It was bitterly cold, but the men of Unit 124 had been trained to ignore the pain, and they were good at it. One of their exercises had been to run 4 miles in sub-zero temperatures, after all. With little regard to their frozen limbs, the men snuck past the U.S. guards along one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth and into South Korea. After traversing rugged mountainsides undetected, they set up camp in a forested area roughly 30 miles from Seoul. Their mission was direct and clear: kill the South Korean president. The men thought that they were sufficiently isolated until they heard 4 frantic voices. 4 brothers were prowling around for firewood, and they found themselves in absolutely the wrong place at absolutely the wrong time. The commandos considered their options. They didn't kill the 4 brothers, partly because the frozen ground would have been digging their graves an arduous task. Instead, they lectured the brothers on the merits of communism. When the brothers feigned allegiance to North Korea, the commandos let them go. They promptly alerted police. By the time police and military had begun hunting for them, Unit 124 had already vanished. They were able to evade capture for 2 days, and on January 21st, 1968, they reached the home of the president, the Blue House. About 10 p.m., wearing South Korean military garb, the men outfoxed the security officers guarding the building. They were within 100 yards of the Blue House when a sentry finally spotted them. The palace grounds erupted in gunfire. The commandos fled in all directions, chased by soldiers. The fight bled into the streets of Seoul, and at the end of the night, over 24 South Koreans died, including civilians. The South Korean army hunted the men for 3 days, killing off as many as they could. In total, 29 of the unit's 31 soldiers were killed. The South Korean president, understandably, was furious, and it was time to retaliate. Enter our story: South Korean Unit 684. In response to the assassination attempt, the South Korean government organized Unit 684, and the men were advised to kill the leader of North Korea. Unit 684 was intentionally modeled after Unit 124, the North Korean assassination squad. That squad had 31 members, and so did Unit 684. They were trained to survive a little frostbite here and there because nothing could stop them from their assassination mission. But unlike the decorated soldiers of the North Korean squad, the men of Unit 684 had little to no military experience. Some sources claim that the men were plucked from death row and offered a chance at redemption. Others claim that the men were vagrants and acrobats. One of the guards described the men as, quote, the kind who would get into street fights a lot, end quote. The training regimen was outlandishly cruel, and 7 men died, at least 1 from just sheer exhaustion. 4 of them attempted to escape the island they were on because they were frustrated with the beatings, the killings, and the poor conditions in the unit, and apparently wanted to alert authorities to their plight. All 4 were beaten to death. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the men, tensions between the Koreas had been easing. By 1971, a mutual frustration with the U.S. brought warming relations between the Koreas. So, Unit 684 was rendered useless. Well, these men were not happy. Not happy at all that the mission they had trained for over 3 years had suddenly been canceled. They still wanted blood, but now they just didn't care whose blood it was. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the recruits ventured out into the sable-black morning of winter under a waxing crescent. They murdered the first trainer while he was asleep with a swift hammer to the skull. Next, they stole guns and ammo, and using their perfected skills, started slaughtering the trainers, most of whom were still drunk or hungover from the night before. Total, the recruits killed 18 guards. Only 6 survived. Satisfied with their bloodthirst, Unit 684 cleaned the blood from their bodies and carefully dressed in their immaculate uniforms because they were going home. They loaded up a stolen bus with a cache of machine guns, knives, and grenades and made their way towards South Seoul. The commandos could almost see their houses when they were met by a police blockade. Trapped on the bus, it was hopeless. But giving up was not an option for Unit 684. Instead, the men clenched grenades and, in unison, yanked the pins. The blast turned the bus's windows into flying specks, and the stench was nauseating, especially in the heat. The men were scattered in bits and pieces everywhere. Somehow or another, 4 of the men still survived, but not for long. Military police yanked them off the bus on stretchers and then imprisoned them. They were executed by firing squad and then buried secretly in the hills outside of Seoul. Their bodies have never been found. In fact, South Korea only recently acknowledged Unit 684's existence. In 2010, the Seoul Central District Court ruled that the family of Unit 684's recruits were entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. North Korea usually comes to mind when we think of a country killing its own citizens. But the Shilmido uprising is an exception. In the Iliad, Homer depicts Ares, the god of war, as a curse on mankind, a kind of supernatural serial killer. In general, the Greeks loathed Ares, often depicting him as a whiny, cowardly, and strange beast. The Romans, however, fawned over Mars, the Roman incarnation of the god of war, majestic, smooth, invincible, often clad in gilded armor as he led men into the battlefield, his very presence making it a field of renown. The story of Unit 684 contains both versions of the mythical god of war. From one angle, the squabbling, bloated, diplomatic mechanisms of war directly cause the death of untold numbers of men and women. War made the Koreas petty. They schemed, and in their cowardice both sides plotted assassins, only to recoil at the last moment. From the other angle, heroism came to life through a band of criminals and misfits, and however misguided, cast a gleaming light over the battlefield as they died. Yet in reality, neither version leaves any survivors.
Trade war is now not a real possibility, it's happening. And isn't that just what we need with Medicare going down the tubes and $1 trillion deficit? Let's put this into perspective. Up on the chalkboard, we have a graph. Zoom in on the graph. Okay. The little blue line is us. Oh, good. We're number 1. We're going up. But notice this graph again. What this graph is from 2002 to 2018, it's the steel markets all over the world. One color is China, one color is Europe, and the blue is us. Notice how they're all going up and down at the same time. If it went up in the US, it goes up in China and Europe. That is until we enacted tariffs. Chinese and European steel prices are falling, but look at the blue line. That's the price of our steel here at home, what we're paying, and it's rising dramatically. What the rest of the world pays is less. We are paying more. Keep in mind, this graph illustrates steel prices before the exemptions ended for both Mexico and Canada. Those tariffs are now in effect. Canada and Mexico are both in the top 5 of the steel suppliers. Together, they make up over a quarter of all steel imports. What do you think is going to happen to the little blue line with the steel price when these tariffs are beginning to bear fruit? Mexico just announced $3 billion in retaliatory tariffs on goods including pork and apples and potatoes and bourbon and cheese. Good thing we don't use any of those things or want to sell them. Life is about to get harder if you work in one of those industries. Canada has announced their tariffs, what they're selling us, $13 billion. Steel, aluminum, food, and things from farms. Oh, okay, all right. Not to be left out, the European Union has followed suit, hitting 200 American products, denim, bourbon, motorcycles, peanut butter, motorboats, and cigarettes. If nothing is done about this, we are in for a very long haul. California's homeless population is now out of control. It's now ballooned to over 134,000 people living on the streets. And the most tragic thing about this is the government has no clue as to why they have this problem to begin with. Well, it used to be when I was a kid that it was because it was nice all the time. Now, it's because you're giving everybody free stuff. Instead of getting to the root of the actual problem, like housing costs, regulation, insane taxes, and the free handouts, the California Brain Trust has decided to give people more money and hope the problem goes away somehow. They're looking at committing $700 million to $1.5 billion to projects that, in many cases, already exist. Some of these projects include additional shelters and hotel vouchers. So, in other words, let's not deal with the causes of why we have these massive problems. Homelessness, people not being able to afford a home, might be because of our taxes and our policies. Could be. No, let's not deal with any of that. Instead, let's make the casualties of our progressive experiment just a little harder to notice. If that sounds pointless and counterproductive, get a load of this one. On July 1st, the city of San Francisco is going to open up 2 facilities called safe injection sites. This is the very definition of sweeping and hiding your problems under the rug. Safe injection sites are facilities where people can go and take illegal drugs. Why? Well, forget the fact that they're, providing a place for people to break the law, but they're also enabling people that are dependent to, some sort of a drug to stay dependent on that drug. Now, did they actually mean to create the perfect metaphor for progressive government? Because that's what always happens. Progressives will give you heroin and keep you hooked on heroin forever. They keep you dependent. That's entirely what leftism is all about. And it's the same with socialized health care. They even use the same argument and catchphrases. Do you remember when Obamacare was going to keep people from dying in the streets? Yeah. Just in from Barbara Garcia, asked whether these safe injection sites might make California a target of the federal government. She said, quote, "That's to be seen, but I'm more worried about people dying in our streets." No, they shouldn't be dying in the streets because you now have universal health care. California's progressive policies are the drug that their government should be addressing. But rather than facing decades of bad decisions, they're just doubling down on them. One city has a new idea to implement a guaranteed income system to address their poverty problems. Now, some residents will begin to receive a no-strings-attached stipend of $500 a month. Forget the fact that Finland, the pride of Bernie Sanders, has already tried this and deemed it too expensive to implement. But screw it, we're California, we're made of money. What better way to motivate the homeless than to guarantee them free money with no real plan on helping them get out of their situation? California is also headed toward full-on climate control crazy town. They just became the first state in the nation to pass a law that puts severe restrictions on water usage. The Golden State will now limit water consumption to 55 gallons per person per day. Now, let me put that into perspective. Let's say you use the restroom 4 times a day. That's 8 gallons. You also do laundries. That is 40 gallons. And God forbid you take a bath. You just use 148 gallons.
You have Roseanne tweeting something. And all of her whole life is over now because of one tweet. And one tweet that I think if she would have said the same thing with a different target, for instance, let's go back to Samantha Bee. If Samantha Bee would have said this, if she would have said the same thing about Sarah Palin, do you think anyone would be talking about anything? No, Sarah Palin was a fine target. She was fine. If you think that Roseanne, if what she said was horrible, do you think she would have been fired had she said it about Candace Owens? No. So wait a minute. There's the double standard. Two of Samantha Bee's sponsors, Auto Trader and State Farm Insurance, have already pulled ads from her show. But there are plenty of advertisers out there that are still advertising. Orkin, Geico, Taco Bell, Apple, who will never place money on any conservative show ever. It is a long-standing policy. Apple, who was run by some evil genius until he died, who in his own book said he went to Fox to try to get me fired. They are still advertising on Samantha Bee. I was bad for the nation. She's okay. Verizon, Outshine Snacks, Haagen-Dazs, Jim Beam, Microsoft, Febreze, Discover, all of those companies think she is okay. None of those companies will ever advertise on talk radio. None of them will. They all pull their support. But they will stand by someone using the C word. Now, I don't want anyone fired. I don't want any advertisement pulled from any show ever. I would really, really appreciate it if this country and the people who are running media and the people who are in media and the people who watch and use media and the people who are on Twitter and Facebook and email would grow the F up. Grow up, America. Grow up. And when you grow up, it requires you to think and be consistent. Let me just start with one character that is in your book that I think really kind of describes how important history has been completely erased. And it's the individual that you talk about in your book, Mum Bet. Can you explain who Mum Bet is?
Yes, gladly. Mum Bet was a slave in colonial Massachusetts in the home of a man named Colonel John Ashley. Mum Bet realized one day after the Revolution and after the Massachusetts State Constitution of 1780 had kicked in, that it contained language saying that all human beings are free and equal in the state of Massachusetts. And it also occurred to her that language had originally been drafted in her master's own house. She went and found a lawyer who had been there present and a participant in the drafting of that language. His name was Theodore Sedgwick, and she retained him. They brought suit in Massachusetts state court seeking a writ of replevin, which is a common law action whereby you can order the return of unlawfully possessed personal property. And she won her freedom, thereby opening the door for every slave in America to eventually become free. It would take decades, to be sure, for everyone else to become free. But Mum Bet won her freedom just by asserting her rights existing under Massachusetts state law after the Revolution. I think that's extraordinary, and I think it's odd that we don't know anything about her.
Isn't it interesting that I believe it was Massachusetts that actually was the state that declared the first slave, because a black man in the 1600s had an indentured servant, and he went to court and made the case. No, he's mine for life. He can't leave after this. He's mine for life, and won. And it's interesting to me. I think that, do you know, Mike? I think that happened in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that sounds right. I am not certain of it, but that sounds right to me. And that makes this ironic. But nonetheless, this story is interesting. It's significant. It's important. And yet most people in the United States have never heard of Mum Bet.
Also involved with Spotify, the Anti-Defamation League, Color of Change.
That's a good one.
That's a great one.
I mean, next thing you know, you'll have people from Color of Change getting praised by the Republican president of the United States. But I digress. Continue, please.
Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE, GLAD, Muslim Advocates, and the International Network Against Cyber Hate. Wow. So
a good across the spectrum groups
yes,
making these
across
decisions.
the spectrum, I would say from far left to slightly
far left,
more than far left.
Oh,
so extreme.
Okay.
Let's say that goes all the way from like communist groups,
okay,
all the way to socialist groups.
All right.
And that's quite a spectrum right there. That's quite a range of advocacy. So Color of Change partners with Black Lives Matter, and they spearheaded boycotts against Bill O'Reilly, somebody named Glenn Beck. They boycotted Trump's inauguration. Surge is dedicated to fighting white supremacy, removing Confederate statues and supporting the anti-Trump resistance. GLAAD, of course, is the LGBTQ activist group that attacks the Trump administration on a daily basis, even though he is the most gay-friendly president ever elected in our country. Muslim Advocates has joined with groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, which is a non-indicted co-conspirator in a terrorist case here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They also partnered, of course, with the International Network Against Cyber Hate. They have a broad mission, but they partnered with the Southern Poverty Law Center, so you know how far left they are. The Southern Poverty Law Center, probably the worst group on this list. I mean, they're unbelievable. Unbelievable.
And so just to recap, these are the groups that Spotify is leaning on to help define hate so they can get those songs out of your range of choices for your little membership there.
Isn't that handy? So this is why I will, I was just starting to think, too. I should probably get on Spotify finally. I use Pandora all the time, and everybody tells me Spotify is better. And I was just thinking, I should get, nope, it saved me that hassle. I'm not going to
have to worry about that.
Not going to have to worry about that now. Yeah. Spotify will not be part of my app choices.
Ten professions in the world that are top of the list that attract psychopaths. Now, psychopath is a designation specifically laid out
is that
by
the crazies?
Mental, and you got sociopaths and psychopaths and whatever.
I get them confused.
They're all slightly different. Not all psychopaths are going to cut you up and eat you. It puts the lotion on its skin. Not everybody is going to make a Chris suit out of you, all right? But they have the foundation to be one of those people. Okay. So what are the professions that lend themselves to psychopaths? Number 2, chefs.
Ooh.
I was at the NRA with Chef Patrick,
and
my
a bunch
friend,
of other chefs.
and a bunch of other chefs. Number 2 on the left, chefs. And I was like, well, okay, great. Number 1 on the list, civil servants.
Ooh.
TSA and half the city of Chicago.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, this is fun. Who else is on the list?
You say psychopaths, right?
Psychopaths. And you got civil servants, number 1. Number 2, chef. Who else is on the list?
Celebrities?
That's not really a profession.
Oh, it's not? Actor?
Okay, let me see here. Not actor, but media.
Okay.
That's us. That would be number 8 for media. And journalist is also on the list. They list them separate.
What about...
And journalist would be number 5.
What about... Oh, I just had it. Oh, man.
So you got chef, number 2. You got civil servant, number
Doctors.
1. Doctor is on the list. Surgeon made number 6, if I get that right. Listed these. Number 6, yes. Specifically surgeon, though. And we've talked about some of these lists before, but surgeon...
Well, I wonder why.
I'm thinking if you're a doctor, you probably... I think surgeons probably have that extra little bit of douchiness. You got to remember, a lot of this comes from ego. Either they become this profession... No, they go into this field because of their ego. In their mind, what is like the greatest? There's a strong ego connection to this. They do that. And also because of control and power.
Oh, okay.
So something that is, seen as, ta-da, doctor.
Then you got to have
and
their
then power and...
police officer, firefighters, and ambulance people.
Number 4, police officer. What were the other firefighter? Not
Firefighter or ambulance people?
Nope. The top 10, only police. Number 4. So here we go. We got civil servant, which there's some overlap there. Chef. Still need number 3. Number 4, cops. Number 5, journalist.
Okay.
Number 6, surgeon. Need number 7 still. Number 8, media. And we need 9 and 10. Number 3, clergy.
What are those?
Priests, ministers,
the
pastors.
clergy. Oh, okay, got it.
Clergy,
oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Power, respect, authority.
What a... CEOs? No, that's not...
CEO.
Oh, okay.
Number 10.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.